The Pentagon briefing room smelled like old coffee and secrets. Maya Hale had forgotten that smell, the particular staleness that came from air recycled through classified ventilation systems for 20 years straight. She stood in the doorway at 6 in the morning, civilian clothes hanging loose on a frame that had shed 15 pounds since leaving the service, and wondered why the hell she'd answered the phone. Colonel Iris Vance sat at the head of a steel table, her prosthetic left hand resting flat against the surface like a paperweight made of carbon fiber and bad memories from Fallujah. The woman's hair had gone steel gray since Maya last saw her, but the eyes were the same. Hard, measuring, the kind of eyes that calculated acceptable losses before breakfast. Sit. Maya didn't sit. She'd spent 6 years learning to ignore orders from people who wore stars on their shoulders. 6 years working lumber yards and hardware stores. 6 years pretending her hands didn't itch for a rifle stock every time she heard distant thunder that sounded too much like artillery. Colonel, I'm civilian now. This better be worth the flight from Portland. Vance slid a manila folder across the table. The motion was precise, economical, the way you'd slide a chess piece into position for checkmate. The folder landed exactly centered between them. It's not worth the flight, for you, but you'll do it anyway. Maya's fingers touched the folder edge. Heavy stock paper, the kind that cost taxpayers 3 times what it should. She opened it. 3 pages, dense text, technical specifications that made her pulse quicken despite herself. At the top of the first page, stamped in red ink that looked almost wet, Doctrinal Review, Non-lethal delay TACTICS. Field test required. You want me to prove I was right? Vance's prosthetic fingers drummed once against the table, a sound like knuckles on a coffin lid. I want you to prove Delta was wrong. There's a difference. The words hung in the recycled air between them. Maya turned the page. Maps, topographical surveys of Virginia mountains, satellite imagery of a forward operating base tucked into the Appalachian foothills, the kind of place where Marines played war games and pretended the enemy would be polite enough to follow the rules of engagement. What's the scenario? Marine Forward Operating Base, Quantico Extension Sector, 36 hours. You delay their assault training exercise, make the base combat ineffective. 0 casualties. If you succeed, Delta reinstates your evaluation record. Clean slate. If you fail. Vance let the sentence die unfinished. They both knew how that story ended. Maya would go back to cutting 2x4s and pretending she didn't wake up at 3 in the morning with her heart racing, hands reaching for weapons that weren't there anymore. She turned to the last page and her hand stopped moving. Base Commander, Major James Briggs. The name hit her chest like a fist wrapped in memory. She could see him still, standing in the North Carolina heat 7 years ago, arms crossed over a chest thick with muscle and scar tissue, watching her fail the final selection test because she'd refused to pull a trigger on bad intelligence. The man who'd taught her to read wind patterns and chemical traces in soil. The man who'd signed the evaluation that ended her career. Problem. Vance's voice could have etched glass. He was my selection instructor. I know, that's why I chose him. He failed you. Now he tests whether he was right to. Maya's thumb traced the edge of Briggs' name on the page. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice that sounded like her dead father whispered that this was a mistake, that going back to prove something to people who'd already made up their minds was the kind of pride that got soldiers killed. She told the voice to shut up. Does he know I'm coming? Not until you announce yourself. Briefing window closes in 4 hours. Clock starts at midnight tonight. 36 hours from first contact. You'll infiltrate, you'll delay, you'll prove non-lethal doctrine works in modern combat scenarios. Or you won't, and we'll all go back to pretending you never existed." Vance stood. The meeting was over. Maya stayed seated for 3 seconds longer than necessary, a small rebellion that felt childish even as she did it. Then she took the folder and walked out into a pentagon corridor that smelled like floor wax and the weight of empire. Her apartment in Maryland was exactly as empty as she'd left it 4 hours earlier. One duffel bag on the floor, one mattress on a frame, kitchen table with 2 chairs, though she never had guests. She dumped the contents of the duffel onto the bed and started sorting. Climbing rope, rated for 250 pounds. Carabiners that had seen better days but still held certification stamps. Night vision monocular, civilian model, the kind you could buy at hunting stores if you had $1,200 and didn't ask questions. A Remington 700 in .308 Winchester, wooden stock worn smooth from use, scope mounted with the kind of care that spoke to thousands of hours at the range. Not military issue. Nothing that would trace back to government armories or raise questions about where a civilian got Delta equipment. She laid out the rifle on the bed and ran her fingers down the barrel. Cold, inert, waiting. In her hands it would wake up and sing, metal and physics combining into something almost alive. She'd missed that song more than she wanted to admit. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but curiosity was a hard habit to break for someone trained to gather intelligence. "Maya, heard you got the call." Male voice, smooth, familiar in a way that made her skin prickle with recognition she couldn't quite place. "Who is this?" Someone who knows what Vance really wants. She's not testing non-lethal doctrine, she's testing you. "For what?" "There's a program, experimental, operators who can win wars without body counts. You're the prototype, don't screw it up." The line went dead. Maya stared at the phone for 10 seconds, then threw it on the bed and went back to packing. Unknown allies were worse than known enemies. At least enemies had the decency to shoot at you from directions you could identify. She picked up an old Delta Force patch from the bedside drawer. Faded tan fabric, worn edges, the words Hale, M, stitched above a single line of text that had defined her adult life. Disqualified, insufficient operational ruthlessness. She'd kept it for 6 years like a splinter she couldn't quite dig out. Now she held it up to the light, reading those words again, feeling the old anger kindle in her chest like coals that had never quite gone cold. Insufficient operational ruthlessness. Because she'd refused to kill a man when the intelligence smelled wrong. Because she'd trusted her judgment over orders. Because she'd been right, and being right without permission was the one sin the military couldn't forgive. She crumpled the patch in her fist, threw it toward the trash can, watched it bounce off the rim and land on the floor. Then she picked it up and put it in her pocket. Some splinters you carried with you. Some wounds you kept fresh on purpose. At Quantico Extension Base, 300 miles south, Major James Briggs stood in front of 250 Marines and lied to them with a straight face. 72-hour force-on-force exercise. Opposing force will be civilian contractors. Rules of engagement. Simulation rounds only. I want this clean, I want this professional, and I want 0 injuries that'll make me file paperwork. The Marines laughed. Good kids, most of them, barely old enough to buy beer legally, playing soldier in the mountains while real wars ground on in deserts they'd never see. Briggs felt the familiar weight of command settle on his shoulders like a yoke made of other people's lives. Lieutenant Sarah Chen stepped forward, tablet in hand, fingers swiping through data with the quick efficiency of someone born holding a phone. "Sir, why the sudden exercise? We just finished the Eastern Corridor drill 2 weeks ago. Pentagon wants data on our new defense system. Argus, Artificial Intelligence Threat Prediction. It reads patterns, anticipates infiltration routes, cuts response time by 40%. We're testing it against contractors to see if it can handle unconventional approaches. Chen nodded, but her eyes held questions she was too smart to ask in front of the troops. Briggs made a mental note to brief her separately. Good officers asked questions. Great officers knew when to ask them in private. He dismissed the formation and walked back to the command center, a converted warehouse with more computer screens than windows. Sergeant Marcus Okoye sat at the Argus console, eyes scanning probability clouds and heat signatures that painted the surrounding mountains in shades of algorithmic certainty. Systems running clean, sir. Prediction accuracy at 94%. Motion sensors online across all perimeters. If a deer sneezes within 2 miles, we'll know about it. Briggs grunted. He'd seen too many systems that looked good on paper turn into expensive scrap metal when reality showed up wearing camouflage and bad intentions. But orders were orders, and if Pentagon wanted data on their new toy, he'd give them data. What he wouldn't tell anyone, not even Chen, was the conversation he'd had with Vance 3 days ago. The one where she'd mentioned a candidate, female, former Delta selection, disqualified for insufficient ruthlessness but exceptional technical skills. The one where Vance had smiled that thin smile of hers and said, "Let's see if she's learned anything." Briggs had known immediately who she meant. There was only one female candidate in the last decade who'd failed Delta on judgment calls rather than physical inability. Maya Hale. The woman who'd tracked a high-value target for 36 hours with textbook precision, then refused to take the shot because something in the target's behavior didn't match the intelligence profile. The woman who'd been right when the review board later confirmed the target was a friendly embedded journalist, not an enemy combatant. The woman he'd failed anyway because being right wasn't the same as following orders. He wondered if she still hated him for that. Probably. He'd hate himself too if their positions were reversed. The thought was interrupted by Okoye's voice, cutting through the command center buzz. "Sir, cooling system alert on the Argus server farm. External condenser showing pressure drop." Briggs walked to the console. Numbers scrolled past, diagnostic codes flashing yellow warnings that hadn't quite escalated to red emergency yet. "Mechanical failure." "Looks like it, sir. Refrigerant leak, probably. Maintenance says 4-hour repair window." "Convenient timing, right before the exercise starts." Okoye looked up, meeting Briggs' eyes with the careful attention of someone who'd served long enough to recognize when officers were thinking several moves ahead. "Sir, you think someone sabotaged it?" "I think we run the exercise on manual backup systems and see what happens. If our contractors are good, they'll exploit the AI weakness. If they're not, we'll know that too." He walked to the window overlooking the base perimeter. Floodlights threw harsh shadows across razor wire and guard towers. Somewhere out there in the Virginia darkness, Maya Hale was coming. He could feel it the way old soldiers felt weather changes in their bones, the certainty that someone dangerous was moving through the night with purpose and skill. He almost smiled. It had been a long time since he'd faced an opponent who made him work for it. Maya hit the perimeter at 2300 hours, approaching from the south through swampland that smelled like rotting vegetation and mosquito breeding grounds. The smart approach was from the north, high ground with clean sight lines and minimal water obstacles, which was exactly why she'd spent 3 hours wading through knee-deep muck that tried to pull her boots off with every step. Argus would be watching the smart approaches. Heat sensors, motion detectors, probability algorithms that painted likely infiltration routes in helpful color-coded warnings. But artificial intelligence had a weakness that human intelligence didn't. It assumed rational actors making optimal choices. It didn't account for someone willing to suffer through miserable conditions just to avoid being predictable. She reached the southern fence line and crouched in the shadows, studying the barrier with eyes that had learned to see in darkness. Chain link, 12 feet high, topped with razor wire that gleamed dull silver in the moonlight. Electric current running through it at intervals, enough to shock but not kill. Motion sensors every 20 meters, mounted on poles that hummed with the particular frequency of active electronics. She pulled a voltage detector from her pack and ran it along the fence base. The readout flickered green, red, mapping the current pattern. There, a dead zone where two fence sections met, the electrical ground interrupted by a gap in the connection. Sloppy installation work, probably done by contractors in a hurry to meet deadline. She dropped flat and wiggled under the fence through the gap, feeling razor wire kiss the back of her jacket close enough to hear the fabric whisper against metal. 10 seconds. Then she was through, inside the perimeter, breathing controlled, and even despite the spike of adrenaline that always came with crossing the line between safe and committed. She checked her watch. 35 hours and 30 minutes remaining. The clock was running whether she was ready or not. Her first target wasn't visible from ground level. She'd studied the satellite imagery for 6 hours, memorizing every building, every vehicle path, every detail that might mean the difference between mission success and painful failure. The Argus server farm sat behind Tower Alpha, housed in a converted storage building with external cooling, units the size of car engines. She moved through shadows like water, finding the path of least resistance, avoiding the obvious patrol routes, staying low and slow. Speed got you noticed. Patience kept you breathing. The cooling unit was exactly where the schematics said it would be, humming its steady mechanical song into the night air. She positioned herself 800 meters out, prone on wet ground that soaked cold through her jacket, and assembled the rifle with motions so practiced they didn't require conscious thought. Stock, action, scope, magazine. The pieces came together like puzzle parts that had been waiting to reunite. She settled the crosshairs on the external condenser and waited, not for the perfect shot, for the perfect moment. Thunder rumbled in the distance, summer storm rolling in from the west. She counted seconds, watching the lightning flicker behind clouds, calculating the delay between flash and sound. When the next bolt lit the sky, she had 3 seconds before the thunder would roll across the base. 1, 2, 3. She pressed the trigger in the space between heartbeats, feeling the rifle kick against her shoulder like a familiar friend saying hello. The sound of the shot merged with thunder, indistinguishable to anyone not specifically listening for it. 800 meters away, the condenser compressor cracked, refrigerant hissing out through a hole the diameter of a pencil. She was already moving before the maintenance alarm started, breaking down the rifle as she walked, packing it away piece by piece. By the time the first technician reached the cooling unit, she was 600 meters away and circling toward her next position. In the Argus control room, Akoi watched his displays flicker and degrade as server temperatures climbed past safe operating ranges. Lieutenant Chen, Argus is running hot. Prediction accuracy down to 60% and dropping. Chen looked up from her own console, frowning. The cooling system. Condenser failure. Maintenance says 4 hours minimum for repair. She picked up the radio and called Briggs. The major's voice came back calm, almost amused. Convenient timing indeed. Run the exercise on manual. If our opposition force is good enough to exploit that weakness in the first hour, they're better than I gave them credit for. Chen signed off and turned back to Akoi. All right, manual protocols. Pull up thermal scans, motion sensors the old-fashioned way. We do this like it's 2005. Alcoy grinned despite the pressure. Roger that, going retro. Maya reached the maintenance tunnel entrance at 0100 hours, 2 hours into her mission timeline. The entrance was hidden behind an equipment shed that hadn't been used since the Cold War ended, the kind of forgotten infrastructure that existed in the gaps between official maps and actual terrain. She pried open the rusted access hatch and dropped into darkness that smelled like concrete dust and 50 years of abandonment. Her night vision monocular painted the tunnel in shades of green ghost light, showing her a path that stretched 200 meters under the base toward the communications trunk. She moved through the tunnel like smoke, placing each footstep carefully to avoid kicking loose stones that might echo. The communications cables ran overhead in bundles thick as her thigh, fiber optic lines carrying data at light speed between command posts and satellite uplinks. She stopped beneath the primary trunk and pulled out 3 thermite charges, each one shaped like a hockey puck and packed with enough heat to burn through steel. She placed them at strategic points along the cable bundle, setting delayed fuses for 4 hours. Long enough for her to be far away when they activated, short enough that the base wouldn't have time to fully compensate. Voices echoed from the tunnel entrance behind her. Footsteps, multiple contacts. She froze, calculating distances and options with the quick math of survival. 30 meters to the voices, 40 meters to the nearest junction, limited space to maneuver. She couldn't fight 4 Marines in close quarters without violating her 0 casualty mandate, which left disappearing. The overhead pipe chase was barely wide enough for her frame, but she pulled herself up into it and went horizontal, wedging her body between corroded metal pipes that felt like they might collapse under her weight. Below, flashlight beams swept the tunnel floor. Corporal Miguel Vega led the patrol, moving with the careful attention of someone who'd survived 2 deployments by not assuming anything was safe. He swept his light across the cable bundles, the walls, the floor. His beam passed 2 feet below Maya's position and kept moving. "Something's off down here. Can you feel it?" Private Torres, young enough to still think courage meant not admitting fear, shook his head. "Feels like every other tunnel to me, Corporal. Dark and smells like ass." Vega wasn't convinced, but he had no concrete reason to report a feeling. They moved deeper into the tunnel system, lights fading. Maya waited 3 full minutes after the sound of their boots disappeared, then lowered herself down and continued toward the exit. She emerged into pre-dawn darkness and pulled out a piece of chalk from her pocket. On the tunnel wall near the entrance, she wrote in quick block letters, 8 alive, none harmed, ask WHY. Let them wonder about that. Let them start questioning what kind of enemy leaves messages instead of bodies. She was 200 meters away when Vega's patrol found the message on their return sweep. The corporal stared at those words for a full 10 seconds before radioing it in. "Lieutenant Chen, you're going to want to see this." In the command center, Briggs studied the photograph Chen had taken of the chalk message. The handwriting was precise, almost architectural in its clean lines. Military training, no question. Someone who'd written countless reports and filled out forms in block capitals until it became second nature. Chen cleared her throat. "Sir," Corporal Vega said, "whoever wrote this moved through that tunnel without triggering a single motion sensor. They're estimating, based on the message location, that the subject was in the tunnel system for at least 20 minutes. Briggs set down the photo and pulled up the base personnel database. His fingers moved across the keyboard with 2-finger typing that would have embarrassed a teenager but got the job done. Pulled Delta Force personnel records, separated operators, female, last 10 years. "Sir, that's classified information. I'd need authorization from." Chen, pull the records. She hesitated, then nodded and turned to her terminal. 3 minutes later, a list populated on the main screen. 12 names. 11 of them were overseas or confirmed in other locations. The 12th made Briggs go very still. Maya Hale, separated 2013. Final evaluation, exceptional technical skills, disqualified for refusing to execute simulated prisoner under orders. He opened her file. The photograph was 7 years old, showing a woman in her late 20s with dark hair pulled back severe and eyes that looked directly at the camera with an intensity that came through even in a personnel photo. He remembered those eyes, remembered the way she'd looked at him when he'd told her she was finished with Delta. That judgment without obedience was worse than incompetence. Chen was watching him. "Sir, do you know her?" "I taught her, and I failed her." The words came out heavier than he'd intended. Chen had the good sense not to press for details. "What are your orders, sir?" "Full alert, non-lethal rules of engagement. I want her caught, not killed." Chen nodded and moved to implement, but Briggs called her back. "Lieutenant, one more thing, she's not trying to hurt us. She's trying to prove a point. The question we need to answer is what happens when she succeeds." Chen looked confused but didn't ask. Briggs turned back to Maya's file and scrolled through her evaluation history. Perfect marks on marksmanship, navigation, survival skills. Top 5% on tactical planning. 0 demerits for physical standards. And then that final evaluation that had ended everything. He'd written it himself. Candidate demonstrates exceptional technical proficiency, but lacks the operational ruthlessness required for Delta assignments. Recommends separation. He'd believed it at the time. Now, staring at those words 7 years later with her message chalk bright in his mind, he wondered if he'd been testing for the wrong qualities. If ruthlessness was really what won wars, or if maybe judgment and restraint were strengths that looked like weakness to men who'd spent their whole lives solving problems with violence. His radio crackled, maintenance reporting that the thermite charges had detonated in the tunnel, severing the primary communications trunk. 70% of external communications were down. Backup systems were compensating, but they were vulnerable now in ways they hadn't been 6 hours ago. Briggs walked to the window and looked out at the base perimeter. Dawn was coming up over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded him of tracer fire. Somewhere out there, Maya Hale was watching the same sunrise, planning her next move, staying 3 steps ahead of every countermeasure he could imagine. He found himself almost smiling. It had been too long since he'd faced someone who made him work this hard. Too long since he'd felt the particular thrill that came from matching wits with an opponent who might actually be better than you. In the tree line 600 meters from the command center, Maya sat with her back against an oak tree and ate an energy bar that tasted like cardboard mixed with optimism. Her voice recorder sat on her knee, red light blinking as she spoke in barely a whisper. Hour 8, 4 positions disabled. Communications at 60%. No casualties, no contact. Briggs is in command, didn't expect that. She paused, chewing slowly, watching the base wake up through her monocular. Marines moving between buildings, vehicles starting their morning patrols, the whole machine of military routine grinding into motion with the mindless efficiency of an anthill. He taught me everything I know about this kind of work. This is going to hurt, but it's going to hurt him too, and that's got to count for something. She clicked off the recorder and pulled out a small photograph from her jacket pocket. 12 people in Delta training gear, standing in formation under a North Carolina sun hot enough to melt asphalt. She was the only woman in the group, third from the left, expression serious and determined. The other 11 had all graduated. All of them were active duty now, running operations in countries whose names never made the news. She touched their faces one by one, remembering names and voices, and the particular way each of them had looked at her after she'd failed selection. Some with pity, some with relief that she'd failed instead of them, one or two with genuine respect that she'd stuck to her principles even when it cost her everything. "This is for all of us they threw away," she whispered to the photograph. "For everyone who was right when they were supposed to be obedient." She put the photo away and checked her remaining supplies. 15 rifle rounds, 2 more thermite charges, 1 flashbang grenade, enough food and water for 30 hours if she was careful. Her body was holding up well, no injuries yet, muscles warm and loose from the nighttime movement. But the easy part was over. Now came the hard work, the part where Briggs would start adapting, where the base would tighten its security and force her to take bigger risks for smaller gains. The part where she'd have to decide how far she was willing to go to prove a point to people who might never admit she was right. She stood, shouldered her pack, and started moving toward her next objective. The vehicle depot, western perimeter, where fuel trucks sat in neat rows waiting for someone to realize they were vulnerable in exactly the ways that mattered most. 30 hours left on the clock. 30 hours to prove that you could win a war without killing anyone. 30 hours to show that being right was worth more than being ruthless. The sun cleared the mountains and threw long shadows across the Virginia hills. Maya walked through those shadows like they were made for her, invisible and patient and absolutely certain of what came next. Behind her, the base alarm started to wail as someone discovered the severed communications trunk. The sound carried across the valley like a promise being kept. She smiled and kept walking. The old fire tower had been abandoned since the 80s, its wooden stairs rotted through in places that made climbing it an act of faith in physics and luck. Maya reached the top platform as the sun climbed higher, turning the Virginia mountains into layers of blue haze that stretched toward a horizon she couldn't see. From up here, the base spread out below like a tactical map come to life, every building and vehicle path exactly where the satellite photos had promised they would be. She set up her observation post with the methodical care of someone who knew that small mistakes compounded into fatal ones. Rifle positioned for quick access, but out of sight from ground level. Water bottles arranged within reach. Voice recorder charged and ready. The platform gave her 360-degree visibility and enough elevation to spot patrol patterns she'd miss from ground level. She pulled out the recorder and pressed the button, speaking barely above a whisper while her eyes never stopped scanning the base perimeter. Hour 8, 4 positions disabled. Communications at 60% capability. No casualties reported. Briggs is in command. I didn't expect that. Thought he'd be at Bragg or overseas by now. But here he is, and that changes the equation. She paused, watching a patrol vehicle make its circuit along the eastern fence line. The driver was young, barely visible at this distance, probably wondering why he joined the Marines if it meant driving in circles around a training base in the middle of nowhere. He taught me everything. How to read terrain, how to think 3 moves ahead, how to make the enemy react to ghosts while you move on the real objective. This is going to hurt. But it's going to hurt him too, because now he knows I'm not the same person who failed his test 7 years ago. Now I'm the nightmare version of what he created. She clicked off the recorder and pulled out the photograph, the one she'd carried through every day of the last 6 years like a penance she couldn't quite pay off. 12 faces staring at the camera with the kind of intensity that came from knowing you were being evaluated on everything, even how you stood for a group photo. She was third from the left, the only woman, chin up and eyes forward like she belonged there even though every statistical analysis said she shouldn't. The other 11 had all graduated. She'd looked them up obsessively in those first 2 years, tracking their careers through the bits and pieces that leaked into public records and veteran networks. 3 were overseas right now, running operations that didn't officially exist. 2 had made sergeant major. 1 had died in Syria, circumstances classified, body never recovered. The rest were scattered across bases and embassies, doing the quiet work that kept empires running. She touched their faces one by one, a ritual she'd repeated so many times the photo was starting to wear thin along the creases. This is for all of us they threw away. For everyone who was right when they were supposed to be obedient. For everyone who saw the target wasn't a threat and held their fire even when it cost them everything. She put the photo away and checked her supplies with the automatic inventory count of someone who'd survived on limited resources before. 15 rifle rounds left. She'd fired one to disable the cooling system, meaning she'd started with 16. Not enough for a sustained engagement, but more than enough if she was smart. 2 thermite charges remaining, already placed in the communications tunnel and ticking toward detonation. 1 flashbang grenade. 3 energy bars that tasted like compressed sadness. 2 liters of water, which would last maybe 18 hours in this heat if she was careful. Her body was holding up well so far. No injuries beyond the normal aches that came from moving through swampland and climbing into fire towers that should have been condemned a decade ago. Muscles warm and responsive, mind clear and focused. She'd trained for worse conditions than this, had gone 72 hours without sleep during selection just to prove she could, had pushed herself to limits that left other candidates crying or quitting or both. But that was 7 years ago, and the body kept its own calendar regardless of what the mind wanted to believe. She was 34 now, not 27. The recovery time was longer. The margin for error was thinner. And somewhere in the back of her awareness, a small voice that sounded like her dead father reminded her that pride went before the kind of fall that left you broken in ways that didn't heal. She told the voice to shut up and started planning her next move. In the command center, Sergeant Alcoy stared at his screens with the fixed intensity of someone watching a magic trick, trying to figure out where the coin went. The Argus system was back online after the cooling repairs, servers humming along at 95% capacity, prediction algorithms painting the surrounding terrain in helpful color, coded threat assessments. Except the predictions were wrong. "Lieutenant Chen, I've got a problem." Chen looked up from her own terminal where she'd been coordinating patrol schedules and trying to make sense of how someone had sabotaged their cooling system without triggering a single alarm. "What kind of problem?" "Argus is showing 0 probability of infiltration on the southern approach, has been for the last 6 hours, but that's where our actual infiltrator came from. The AI completely missed it." Chen walked over and studied the displays. The southern quadrant glowed a calm blue on the threat map, indicating minimal risk. Everything Argus knew about tactical doctrine said that approach was suboptimal, too much water and difficult terrain, low probability that a rational actor would choose it. "Pull up the raw sensor data. Not the AI interpretation, just the actual readings." Alcoy's fingers danced across the keyboard. Numbers scrolled past, time stamps and sensor triggers, and a pattern that made Chen's stomach tighten with the understanding of just how badly they'd been played. There, motion sensors triggered at 0300 hours, southern perimeter, but the pattern matches wildlife movement. Argus flagged it as deer and ignored it. Chen leaned closer, reading the sensor log with eyes that had learned to see past the obvious answers to the questions underneath. "Show me a deer that moves in a perfectly straight line for 300 meters without stopping to graze. Show me a deer that weighs exactly 140 pounds according to the pressure sensors. Show me a deer that knows to step around the sensor grid gaps." Akoi went very still. She spoofed the AI, made it think she was an animal. Chen straightened and reached for the radio. "Major Briggs, you need to see this." Briggs arrived 3 minutes later, moving with the economical stride of someone who'd learned to conserve energy for when it mattered. He studied the sensor data in silence, his face showing nothing but the small tightness around his eyes that meant he was processing implications and running scenarios. She knows how Argus thinks. Either she studied the system specs before arrival, or she's adapting in real time to its pattern recognition. Either option means we're dealing with someone who understands our capabilities better than we understand our own vulnerabilities. Chen nodded. "Recommendations, sir." Briggs looked at the map, at the blue calm of the AI's false confidence, at the reality of an opponent who turned their most sophisticated system into a liability. "We stop trusting the algorithm. Go back to basics. Human observation, patrol rotations, the kind of security that worked before we had computers doing our thinking for us. And we accept that she's going to stay ahead of us unless we start thinking like her instead of trying to predict her." He turned to Akoi. "Can you track her actual movements instead of letting Argus filter the data?" "Yes, sir, but it'll be manual analysis. Slow, resource-intensive." "Then get it done. I want to know everywhere she's been and everywhere she might go next. Build me a profile based on what she's actually doing, not what the computer thinks she should do." Briggs walked to the window and looked out at the mountains where morning light was burning off the last of the mist. Somewhere in those hills, Maya Hale was watching him back, planning her next move, staying 3 steps ahead of every countermeasure he could imagine. He'd trained dozens of operators over the years, watched them succeed and fail, and sometimes die in ways that left scars on his conscience he'd carry to the grave. But Maya had been different. She'd had that rare combination of technical excellence and moral clarity that made her either the best operator you'd ever work with or the most dangerous liability you'd ever have to manage. Delta had chosen liability. He'd signed off on that choice. Now she was here to prove him wrong, and the hell of it was, she might actually succeed. His radio crackled, Corporal Vega reporting from the eastern perimeter. "Sir, we've got movement in the generator farm area. Thermal shows a signature moving through the sublevel tunnels." Briggs felt his pulse quicken with the rush that came from the hunt. "All units converge on generator farm. Rules of engagement remain non-lethal. I want eyes on the target but no contact unless absolutely necessary. Let's see where she's going." He grabbed his gear and headed for the door, Chen falling in step behind him. The game was accelerating now, moving from careful setup into the active phase where mistakes got punished and hesitation got you killed. Or in this case, got you mission failure, which for someone like Maya might be worse than dying. Maya heard the activity above her and smiled in the darkness of the steam tunnel. The generator farm sublevel was exactly as miserable as the schematics had suggested, a maze of pipes carrying superheated water and steam through concrete corridors that hadn't seen maintenance in 20 years. The temperature was pushing 110 degrees Fahrenheit, humidity near saturation, the kind of environment that turned human bodies into inefficient meat engines struggling to shed heat. She'd been down here for 20 minutes and could already feel the effects. Sweat soaking through her clothes, heart rate elevated, the beginning of heat exhaustion making her thoughts feel slow and sticky. But she'd come here for a reason, and discomfort was just another variable to manage. The generator control panel was mounted on the wall like a relic from the Cold War. All analog gauges and mechanical switches that predated digital controls by a good 30 years. She studied it with the focused attention of someone who understood that old systems had vulnerabilities new ones didn't. that sometimes the best technology was the kind that didn't think it was smarter than the human operating it. She pulled out her multi-tool and opened the panel access door. Inside, wiring ran in bundles color-coded by someone who'd learned electrical systems before computers made everything complicated. She traced the circuits with her eyes, following the logic of how power flowed from generators to distribution nodes to the base systems that depended on electricity like humans depended on oxygen. There, the voltage regulator, a component the size of a shoebox that modulated generator output to match demand. It was old enough that it still used mechanical relays instead of solid-state electronics, which meant it was vulnerable to the kind of exploit that required patience and a basic understanding of physics. She didn't smash it. That would be obvious, easy to detect and repair. Instead, she reprogrammed it using the manual adjustment screws, setting the voltage regulation threshold lower by exactly 15%, small enough that the system would appear functional, large enough that over the next 6 hours, the generators would throttle down to 40% output as the regulator incorrectly interpreted normal demand as excessive load. Delayed sabotage, the kind that looked like equipment failure instead of hostile action, the kind that would make them waste hours troubleshooting a problem they didn't know was deliberate. She closed the panel and checked her watch. 28 hours remaining. She needed to move. The exit from the steam tunnel required crawling through 150 feet of pipe that felt like being slowly cooked in a pressure cooker. By the time she emerged into the relatively cool air of a maintenance shed, her clothes were soaked through and her vision was starting to blur at the edges. She stripped off her outer layer, the fabric steaming in the morning air, and assessed the damage. Burns on both forearms where she'd accidentally brushed against hot pipes. Not serious, but painful and prone to infection if she didn't keep them clean. Mild heat exhaustion, manageable with water and rest. A headache building behind her eyes that warned of dehydration. She pulled out her voice recorder, hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline come-down. Generator patch deployed. It'll hurt them in 6 hours when they least expect it. Cost me some skin and probably a few IQ points from the heat. Fair trade if it works. Her voice sounded rougher than she wanted, stress and dehydration turning it into something that barely sounded like her. She clicked off the recorder and forced herself to drink half a liter of water even though her stomach protested. The body was a machine that needed fuel and cooling, and ignoring its requirements was how operators ended up dead in ways that looked stupid in the after-action reports. Above her, she could hear vehicles moving, voices calling coordinates, the organized chaos of a base shifting into active response mode. They knew she was in this area, probably had thermal imaging sweeping the buildings, patrol teams converging, the whole security apparatus focusing its attention on finding her. Which meant she needed to be somewhere else. She pulled out a thermal emergency blanket from her pack, the kind that reflected body heat and made you nearly invisible to infrared cameras. Wrapped it around herself and moved to the back corner of the maintenance shed, settling into a gap between old equipment crates that put her out of the sight lines from the doors. Then she waited, patient, still, breathing controlled and even, letting the hunters sweep past while she became part of the background, just another piece of forgotten equipment in a shed full of things nobody had needed for 20 years. Boot steps outside. Close. She could hear Corporal Vega's voice directing his team, professional and thorough, the kind of NCO who took his job seriously even when it was just training exercises that didn't mean anything. Thermal sweep negative, buildings empty. Check it anyway, physical search every corner. The door opened, and 2 Marines entered, moving with the careful attention of people who knew that empty buildings sometimes weren't. They swept the shed in a pattern that would have found her if she'd been anywhere but where she was, but patterns had gaps and gaps were where ghosts lived. They left after 3 minutes, reporting negative contact, moving on to the next building in their search grid. Maya waited another 10 minutes after their footsteps faded, counting her heartbeats and listening to the sounds of a base that thought it was hunting her, when really she was just waiting for them to look somewhere else. When she finally emerged from the shed, the sun was at its apex and the heat was pushing into the 90s. She moved toward the tree line with the unhurried pace of someone who knew that speed attracted attention and patience kept you breathing. Behind her, the base continued its futile search of empty buildings and tunnels she'd already abandoned. Briggs stood in the generator farm control room and studied the diagnostics with the growing certainty that he'd been played. Again, the thermal sweep had shown a heat signature in the sublevel tunnels, clear and strong, exactly the kind of reading you'd expect from a human body in that environment. Except when the teams arrived, they'd found nothing. No physical evidence, no disturbed dust, no signs of passage beyond what maintenance personnel would normally leave. Just the lingering heat from the steam pipes and the frustration that came from chasing contacts that disappeared like smoke. Chen entered carrying a tablet, her expression showing the careful neutrality of someone delivering bad news to a superior officer. "Sir, we found something. Or rather, we found where something should be but isn't." "Show me." She pulled up thermal imaging from 30 minutes ago, the recorded data showing a bright signature moving through the tunnel system. Then she overlaid it with the current scan. The signature was still there, in exactly the same position, which was impossible unless the person had remained completely motionless for half an hour in 100-degree heat. "It's a decoy, heat pack or chemical warmer, something that mimics human thermal output. She placed it and left while we were responding to what we thought was her location." Briggs felt a reluctant admiration mixing with his frustration. Classic misdirection. Make the enemy commit resources to an empty threat while you accomplish the real objective somewhere else. He taught that technique himself, demonstrated it in exercises, watched candidates succeed or fail based on how well they understood that warfare was as much about perception as reality. What was the real objective? What did she actually accomplish while we were hunting a decoy? Chen pulled up the generator farm system's data. At first glance, everything looked normal. Power output steady. No alarms. No obvious signs of tampering. But she zoomed in on one specific metric, the voltage regulation curve, and Briggs saw it immediately. The regulator's been adjusted. Manual calibration, not digital override. It's set to throttle down over the next several hours. By tonight, our generator output will be at 40%, and the system will think it's responding correctly to load demand. Briggs ran the math in his head. 40% power meant critical systems would still function, but operational capacity would be severely degraded. Lights would dim. Argus would have to run on reduced processing. Climate control would struggle. The base wouldn't be dead, but it would be crippled. Time delay sabotage. She's thinking 4 moves ahead while we're still reacting to her last move. "Yes, sir, and sir, there's something else." Chen pulled up medical data, biosensor readings from the thermal imaging analysis. Based on the heat signature duration and the environmental conditions in those tunnels, whoever was down there experienced significant heat stress. Core temperature elevation, probable dehydration, risk of heat exhaustion. She's paying a physical price for these operations. Briggs studied the data and felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest. Pride, maybe, that an operator he'd trained was tough enough to push through conditions that would stop most people. Or concern that she was pushing too hard, that the mission was becoming more important than survival. Or perhaps just the recognition that warfare always extracted its cost, and sometimes the cost was measured in burned skin and bodies pushed past their limits. Can she sustain this for another 28 hours? Chen met his eyes. Medically, probably not without significant degradation in performance, but operators like her don't quit just because their body says they should. They quit when the mission's done or they're physically incapable of continuing. Which means we need to make her physically incapable before she accomplishes whatever her endgame is. He walked to the window and looked out at the base, at the Marines going about their duties with the casual efficiency of people who thought this was just another training exercise. They didn't know they were extras in a demonstration that might change how the military thought about force deployment and operational restraint. They didn't know that their every move was being watched and measured and used as data points in an argument about whether killing was necessary or just convenient. Get me a profile on her likely next targets, not what Argus predicts, what you predict based on pattern analysis of her actual behavior, and increase patrols around critical infrastructure, but make it look routine. I don't want her to know we've figured out her methodology. Chen nodded and left to implement. Briggs remained at the window, watching shadows lengthen as the day burned toward afternoon. His phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Colonel Vance. Status report required. Candidate performance evaluation. He typed back with thumbs that felt too large for the tiny keyboard. Candidate exceeding parameters. Non-lethal doctrine proving viable. Recommend continued observation. Vance's response came back almost immediately. Noted, maintain pressure. Need to see performance under extreme stress. Do not make this easy. Briggs pocketed the phone and felt the weight of what Vance was really asking. Push Maya harder. Make her hurt. Test her limits not to see if she'd break, but to see what she was capable of when breaking should have been the rational choice. He'd signed up for this when he agreed to the evaluation. Didn't mean he had to like it. Maya reached her cache point in the abandoned water tower as the sun started its descent toward the western mountains. The climb up the rusted ladder had taken longer than it should have, her arms shaking with fatigue and her vision swimming with spots that warned of low blood, sugar, and dehydration that water alone couldn't fix. She collapsed on the small platform at the top and let herself have 60 seconds of just breathing, just existing, just feeling the ache that came from pushing a body past its comfortable limits. Then she forced herself upright and pulled out her remaining supplies. One energy bar left. She'd eaten the other two over the course of the day, burning through calories faster than she could replace them. 1 liter of water remaining from her original 15 rifle rounds. 1 flashbang. The thermite charges were already deployed and ticking, irrelevant to her current inventory. She checked her arms where the burns from the steam tunnel had started to blister. The skin was red and angry, weeping clear fluid that would turn into infection if she didn't keep it clean. She had no medical supplies beyond basic first aid, which meant she had a choice between using her drinking water to clean wounds or saving it to stay hydrated. She chose hydration. Infection took days to kill you. Dehydration took hours. The voice recorder felt heavy in her hand when she pulled it out. She pressed record and heard her own voice come back rough and strained. Hour 18. 5 targets down. Generator code will activate in 4 hours. They're adapting faster than I expected. Briggs is good, better than I remembered. He's not just reacting, he's learning. That makes this harder. She paused, looking down at her burned arms, at the way her hands trembled even when she tried to hold them steady. Condition declining. Burns infected, probably. Vision blurring at the edges. Need to finish this before I drop. 28 hours to go. Might not make it that long, but I'll make it long enough. She clicked off the recorder and pulled out the photograph one more time. The faces stared back at her through the golden light of late afternoon, frozen in a moment when they'd all believed they had a future in Delta, when the possibility of failure seemed like something that happened to other people. I'm doing this for all of you, for everyone they said wasn't good enough, for everyone who was right when they should have been obedient. Her fingers touched the face of the operator who died in Syria, James Chen, no relation to the lieutenant currently hunting her. He'd been the best of them, faster and stronger and smarter, everything Delta claimed they wanted. And he died anyway in some classified operation that didn't officially exist, body never recovered, parents told he was killed in a training accident. The military ate its young and called it necessary. Someone had to prove there was another way. She put the photo away and checked her target list. 3 objectives remaining. Vehicle depot, which she decided to skip because the risk-to-reward ratio was poor. Armory ventilation, moderate difficulty. And the 8th target, the one she'd kept redacted even in her own notes, the one that would either prove her point definitively or get her caught trying. The Nexus Junction, where every system on the base converged into a single underground chamber that hadn't been upgraded since the base was built in the 60s. Take that down and the entire base went dark. Power, water, communications, everything dependent on infrastructure that someone had decided wasn't worth modernizing, because what were the odds anyone would actually know it existed? Maya had spent 6 hours studying declassified base schematics, and another 4 cross-referencing with geological surveys to find that weakness. Now, she was going to exploit it in ways that would make military engineers rethink their assumptions about what needed protecting. But first, she had to survive the next 8 hours. She descended the water tower as the sun touched the horizon, moving carefully because fatigue made you clumsy and clumsy got you killed. At the bottom, she paused in the shadows and watched the base light up for evening operations. Floodlights threw harsh illumination across the perimeter. Guard towers cycled through their spotlight rotations. Somewhere in the command center, Briggs was looking at maps and making decisions about where to deploy his forces. She needed him looking the wrong direction, needed him confident he'd figured out her pattern, needed him to believe she'd attack from the west while she was actually circling back to the east. She pulled out her last thermite charge and hefted it thoughtfully. This one wasn't going on a timer. This one was going to announce itself immediately and loudly, pulling every available unit to respond while she slipped past in the chaos. She moved through the darkness toward the vehicle depot she decided not to hit, carrying the one piece of misdirection that might buy her enough time to reach the real objective. In the command center, Akoy was the first to notice the pattern. "Lieutenant Chen, I've got something. The infiltrator's been moving clockwise around the base perimeter. Started south, moved east, then to the generator farm on the northeast corner. If the pattern holds, next target should be west side, vehicle depot or armory." Chen studied the map and nodded slowly. "Makes sense. Vehicle depot would cripple our rapid response capability. Armory would limit our weapons availability, though with non-lethal row that matters less." She called Briggs over and showed him the analysis. The major studied it with the careful attention of someone who knew that obvious patterns were sometimes deliberate deceptions. "Set Overwatch on both locations. Thermal imaging, motion sensors, the works, but keep a reserve force mobile. If she's smart enough to spoof our AI, she's smart enough to make us think we've figured her out." Chen began issuing orders, coordinating teams, moving pieces on the tactical chessboard. Briggs watched the activity and felt the familiar tension of command, the knowledge that decisions made in comfortable rooms with good lighting would determine whether young Marines went home safe or got hurt doing jobs that didn't matter beyond the training value. His phone buzzed. Vance again, always watching, always measuring. "Major, I'm seeing reduced activity from your candidate. Is she compromised?" Briggs considered how to answer that. Maya hadn't made a move in 4 hours, which either meant she was resting and preparing for a major operation, or she was more hurt than the biosensor data suggested and running on fumes. "Negative, Colonel. Assess she's consolidating for final phase operations. Recommend we maintain current pressure and see what she does next." Vance's response was immediate. "Maintain pressure is insufficient. I want active countermeasures. Make her react instead of letting her dictate tempo." Briggs stared at the message and felt anger kindle in his chest. Vance wanted him to hunt Maya actively, to turn this from an evaluation into a combat operation, which meant either Vance didn't understand the difference, or she understood perfectly and was testing something else entirely. He typed back carefully. "Recommend against active pursuit. Candidate's row requires 0 casualties. Aggressive pursuit increases injury risk to our personnel if she's forced into defensive actions." The response took longer this time, which meant Vance was either considering his point or composing a rebuttal that would leave no room for argument. "Your recommendation is noted and overruled. Pursue actively. If she can't handle pressure, she's not revenant material. Vance out." Briggs set down the phone and turned to Chen. "Change of plans. We're going active. I want teams sweeping likely hide positions. Use of force authorized for detainment, non-lethal methods only. Find her and bring her in." Chen looked surprised but nodded. "Sir, that's a significant escalation. She might interpret it as exactly what it is. A test to see if she can maintain her 0 casualty mandate when we're actively trying to catch her. Brief the teams. I want this done by the book, no cowboy shit. No one gets hurt on either side." Orders went out. Teams mobilized. The base shifted from passive defense into active hunter mode, Marines moving through the darkness with night vision and thermal scopes, covering ground in overlapping search patterns that would find anything that moved. Maya watched them from 300 meters out and smiled despite the exhaustion pulling at her bones. They were doing exactly what she needed them to do: consolidating, focusing, committing resources to sectors she'd already abandoned. She triggered the thermite charge remotely, a simple radio detonator she'd rigged before placing it near the vehicle depot. The explosion lit the night sky like a small sun being born, white-hot magnesium burning through metal and sending a pillar of flame 50 feet into the air. Every alarm on the base screamed in unison. Teams pivoted and sprinted toward the vehicle depot. Officers shouted coordinates. The organized machine of military response kicked into high gear, everyone moving with purpose toward the bright burning distraction she'd given them. Maya moved in the opposite direction, east instead of west, using the chaos and the light blindness it caused to slip past perimeter patrols that were looking toward the flames instead of the shadows behind them. She covered 200 meters in 3 minutes, breathing hard and vision swimming, every step feeling like it cost more than the last. The Nexus Junction entrance was hidden behind an equipment shed that looked abandoned, the kind of structure you stopped seeing after you'd walked past it enough times. She picked the lock with hands that shook from fatigue and blood sugar crash, the mechanism resisting for precious seconds before yielding with a click that sounded too loud in her ears. Inside, concrete steps led down into darkness that smelled like 50 years of neglect and the dampness of underground spaces that never saw sunlight. She descended 40 feet into the earth, counting steps because her mind needed something to focus on besides the pain in her arms, and the way her legs felt like they might stop supporting her weight at any moment. The Nexus Junction was exactly as the schematics had shown, a chamber the size of a high school gymnasium, filled with pipes and cables and junction boxes that connected every vital system on the base to the infrastructure that kept it running. Power trunks thick as tree limbs, water mains that could supply a small town, data conduits carrying information at speeds that would have seemed like magic to the engineers who'd built this place in the 60s. She had 2 thermite charges left and 11 hours to midnight, more than enough time to place them and set timers that would give her margin for escape, more than enough time to complete the mission and prove that one operator with patience and skill could cripple a base without firing more than a handful of shots. She took 3 steps toward the primary power trunk and her legs gave out, just stopped working, muscles exhausted past the point where will alone could compel them. She went down hard, hitting the concrete floor with impact that drove the air from her lungs and sent bright stars across her vision. For a moment she just lay there, breathing, feeling her heart hammer against her ribs like it was trying to escape. Her voice recorder was still in her pocket. She pulled it out with fingers that barely responded to her commands. Made it Nexus Junction. 11 hours on the clock, condition. Bad, might not make it out, doesn't matter, mission first. She clicked it off and forced herself to sitting position. Her burns were weeping fluid that soaked into her shirt. Her vision kept trying to tunnel down to a small point of clarity surrounded by gray nothing. Her hands shook so badly she had to brace them against her knees to make them still. But she'd made it. Against Briggs and his Marines and an AI system that should have found her a dozen times over. Against heat and exhaustion and a body that wanted to quit. She'd made it to the objective with enough time to finish the job. She pulled out the thermite charges and started crawling toward the power trunk, because walking was apparently not an option anymore, and the mission didn't care whether you completed it on your feet or your knees. Above her, alarms continued to wail as the base fought the vehicle depot fire. Briggs stood in the command center watching thermal imaging that showed his teams converging on a target that had already moved on, and felt the frustration of a chess player realizing he'd been thinking 2 moves ahead while his opponent was thinking 5. Chen appeared at his elbow. "Sir, the vehicle depot explosion was thermite, professional grade, remotely detonated. No casualties, but 3 trucks are total losses." Briggs nodded, still watching the displays. "She's not at the depot, is she?" "No, sir. That was misdirection. Thermal shows she moved east during the response, but we lost her in the perimeter shadows." "Where would you go if you were her? You've got 11 hours left, you're exhausted, you're hurt, and you need one final objective that proves your point definitively." Chen thought about it, staring at the base map with the kind of focus that came from knowing the right answer might be the difference between success and failure. Infrastructure, something centralized, somewhere that taking it down would cripple everything at once instead of degrading systems piecemeal. She pulled up the base utilities map and zoomed in on a section that showed convergence points. Power, water, communications, all running through junction points before distributing to individual buildings. And there, marked on schematics from 1964, a chamber that newer maps didn't even show because it had been absorbed into the background infrastructure. "Nexus Junction, sir. I don't think anyone's been down there in 20 years. Briggs felt his stomach drop. "Can she access it?" "If she has the old schematics, yes. There's a surface entrance behind Building 7. He was moving before she finished the sentence, grabbing his radio and issuing orders as he ran toward the vehicle bay. "All units converge on Building 7, East Perimeter. Suspect is accessing underground infrastructure. Move now." He jumped into a Humvee and drove with the kind of speed that was probably unsafe, but felt necessary, covering ground while his mind raced through scenarios. If Maya reached Nexus Junction and took it down, the base would be completely combat ineffective. Mission success. Evaluation passed. Delta would have to acknowledge that non-lethal operations could achieve strategic objectives. But if she was as hurt as the biosensor data suggested, she might not make it out, might collapse down there in the dark, 40 feet underground, while systems failed around her, might prove her point and pay for it with her life, because pride and stubbornness didn't care about the difference between victory and survival. He reached Building 7 in 4 minutes that felt like 40. The entrance to Nexus Junction was open, lock-picked with professional skill, stairs descending into darkness that his flashlight couldn't quite penetrate. He keyed his radio. "Chen, I'm going in. Have medical standing by at the entrance. If she's down here, she's going to need it." "Sir, wait for backup." "Negative, every second counts." He descended into the earth with his weapon ready but not raised, moving through shadows that hadn't seen human presence in years. At the bottom of the stairs, the chamber opened up vast and echoing, filled with the hum of equipment and the drip of water from pipes that had been weeping condensation since before he was born. Maya was on her knees beside the primary power trunk, hands working to place a thermite charge, even though those hands were shaking so badly she kept dropping the adhesive backing. Her face was pale in his flashlight beam, eyes too bright with fever, arms wrapped in improvised bandages that were soaked through with fluid from burns that should have sent her to a hospital hours ago. She looked up at him and smiled, the expression showing more teeth than humor. "Hello, Major. Come to watch me finish." Briggs lowered his weapon and approached slowly, hands visible, making himself non-threatening even though every tactical instinct screamed that he was walking into an unknown situation with an armed operator who had every reason to see him as an enemy. "Maya, you need medical attention, now." She shook her head and went back to placing the charge, fingers fumbling with the timer mechanism. "I need 11 more hours. Then I'll take all the medical attention you want to give me, but not before I finish." He knelt beside her, close enough to see the fine tremor running through her whole body, close enough to smell the sour sweat of someone pushed past endurance. "You've already proven your point. 4 targets down, base combat effectiveness degraded by 60%, 0 casualties. That's enough for the evaluation. Not enough to change minds. Not enough to make Delta admit they were wrong. I need total success. I need them to see that I could have crippled this entire base and no one had to die for it." Her hand slipped again and the thermite charge fell, hitting the concrete with a sound that made them both flinch. Briggs picked it up and held it, feeling the weight of explosive that could burn through steel in seconds. "Let me help you." She stared at him with eyes that held too much pain and too much determination to know which would win. "Why would you help me? I'm here to prove you wrong. To prove that you failed me for the wrong reasons and Delta lost a good operator because you couldn't see past your doctrine. Because you were right. 7 years ago, you were right to refuse that kill order when the intel didn't match the reality. You were right to trust your judgment over commands that turned out to be wrong, and I was wrong to fail you for it." The words hung in the damp air between them. Maya's hand stopped shaking for just a moment, clarity cutting through the fever haze. "You knew." "I knew. The review board confirmed it 3 days after we separated you. Target was friendly, bad intel. You made the right call. But by then the decision was made and Delta doesn't reverse course just because someone was right for the wrong reasons. So you let me walk away. Let me spend 7 years thinking I'd failed because I wasn't ruthless enough. Briggs felt the weight of that accusation like a physical thing. Yes, and I've regretted it every day since. Which is why I'm here now, offering to help you finish what you started. Not because Vance ordered me to evaluate you, because you deserve to succeed. Maya studied his face, looking for the lie, for the trap, for whatever angle he was playing. But his eyes held nothing but tired honesty and the regret that came from knowing you'd made a choice that hurt someone who didn't deserve it. She reached out and took the thermite charge from his hands. Then help me set this timer. My hands aren't steady enough anymore, and I'll be damned if I get this close and fail because my fingers won't cooperate. Briggs helped her set the charge and program the timer for 10 hours and 55 minutes, 5 minutes before her deadline. Margin for error in case something went wrong. They placed it carefully on the primary power trunk, adhesive backing holding it firm against metal that would burn like the sun when the thermite ignited. When it was done, Maya tried to stand and couldn't. Her legs just wouldn't respond, muscles exhausted past the point of function. Briggs caught her before she fell and lifted her in a fireman's carry that brought back memories of combat rescues and training exercises where you learned to move wounded teammates under fire. She didn't protest, didn't say anything at all, just let herself be carried up the stairs toward light and air and the kind of help that came too late to prevent damage but might be enough to prevent something worse. At the top of the stairs, Chen waited with a medical team. They took Maya from Briggs' arms and laid her on a stretcher with the careful efficiency of people who knew that rough handling could turn manageable injuries into critical ones. An IV went into her arm, oxygen mask over her face, hands checking vitals and calling out numbers that meant her body was running on fumes and spite. Briggs stood back and let them work, feeling the adrenaline drain away and leave behind exhaustion that made his own legs feel unsteady. His radio crackled, Vance's voice, sharp with the authority of someone who'd been watching through satellite feeds and situation reports. Major, you extracted the candidate before mission completion. Explain. Briggs keyed the radio and chose his words carefully. Candidate had placed final charge on target with timer set. Mission parameters met. Extraction was medical necessity, not tactical failure. She succeeded, Colonel. Total base combat ineffectiveness achieved through non-lethal means. There was a long pause. When Vance spoke again, her voice held something that might have been satisfaction or might have been the pleasure of being proven right. Noted, stand by for further instructions. Vance out. Briggs watched the medics load Maya into an ambulance, watched the vehicle drive away toward medical facilities that could treat burns and exhaustion, and the kind of damage that came from pushing a human body past every reasonable limit. She'd done it. Against every odd, against his countermeasures, against an AI system and 250 Marines and her own failing body. She'd proven that you could win without killing, that doctrine could be wrong, that being right mattered even when it cost you everything. He pulled out his phone and typed a message to the personnel file he'd closed 7 years ago. Operator Hale evaluation. Recommend full acceptance into Revenant program. Demonstrated exceptional capability under extreme conditions. Previous assessment was in error. She doesn't lack ruthlessness. She possesses something better. Judgment. He hit send and walked back toward the command center, where Chen was already coordinating the base shutdown sequence before the thermite charges detonated. Somewhere in the Virginia night, Maya Hale was unconscious in an ambulance, unaware that she just changed the future of military doctrine and earned back the career she'd lost for being right. The base alarms would sound in 10 hours, the charges would detonate, the lights would go dark, and in the morning, When damage assessment teams surveyed what one operator had accomplished alone, they would find 0 casualties and total mission success. Exactly as she'd promised. Maya woke to the smell of antiseptic and the silence that came from hospital rooms designed to insulate patients from the chaos outside their doors. Her left arm was wrapped in gauze that looked too white against her skin, IV lines running into the crook of her elbow like mechanical vines. The burns throbbed with a dull ache that told her she'd been medicated, but not enough to completely kill the pain. She tried to sit up and discovered that her body had opinions about that plan, all of them negative. Her muscles screamed protest, ribs complaining about movements that should have been simple. Someone had stripped her out of her field clothes and put her in a hospital gown that tied in the back and left her feeling exposed in ways that had nothing to do with fabric. The clock on the wall read 0600 hours. Morning light filtered through blinds that needed dusting, painting stripes across linoleum that had been mopped so many times the pattern was starting to wear through. She'd been unconscious for 8 hours, maybe 9, which meant the thermite charges had detonated 2 hours ago, which meant the base was dark and her mission was complete, and she'd succeeded while unconscious in a hospital bed. The irony wasn't lost on her. The door opened, and a nurse entered, young enough to still have that optimistic energy that came from believing medicine could fix anything if you just followed the protocols. She checked Maya's vitals with practiced efficiency, making notes on a tablet that probably cost more than Maya's entire monthly rent. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got run over by a Humvee and then dragged behind it for good measure." The nurse smiled, the kind of professional sympathy that acknowledged pain without dwelling on it. "Your burns are 2nd degree, no permanent damage expected. Dehydration was severe, but we've been pumping fluids for 8 hours. Core temperature is back to normal. You're going to be sore for a while, but you'll heal." "When can I leave?" The nurse's smile faded into something more guarded. "That's not my decision. There are people who want to talk to you first." Maya knew what that meant. Debriefing, after-action reports, questions about methods and decisions, and whether she'd violated any protocols that might give them reason to disqualify her again. She'd been through it before, the bureaucratic dissection of operations that reduced human choices to checkboxes on evaluation forms. "Send them in. Let's get this over with." The nurse left and Maya was alone with her thoughts for exactly 3 minutes before the door opened again. Colonel Vance entered first, prosthetic hand catching the morning light as she pulled a chair close to the bed. Major Briggs followed, looking like he hadn't slept, dark circles under eyes that held something Maya couldn't quite identify. Concern, maybe, or respect, or the exhaustion that came from watching someone push themselves to destruction and being unable to stop them. Vance sat without preamble, pulling out a tablet and swiping through screens that probably contained every detail of Maya's 36-hour operation. Operator Hale. Mission assessment shows complete success. All 8 targets neutralized or degraded. Base combat effectiveness at 0% as of 0400 hours when your charges detonated. 0 casualties among friendly forces. 0 permanent infrastructure damage. By every measurable parameter, you exceeded mission requirements. Maya waited for the other shoe to drop. There was always an other shoe. However, there it was. However, your methods pushed acceptable risk thresholds. 2nd-degree burns, severe dehydration, heat exhaustion approaching critical levels. If Major Briggs hadn't extracted you when he did, you would have remained in Nexus Junction when systems failed. In the dark, 40 feet underground, with injuries that would have prevented self-extraction. You would have died proving a point. Maya met Vance's eyes and saw her own stubbornness reflected back. "But I didn't die. I completed the mission with acceptable personal risk managed within operational parameters. Isn't that what you wanted to see? Whether I could push through adverse conditions and still accomplish strategic objectives. Vance's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture. A slight relaxation that suggested Maya had given the right answer to a question that wasn't quite the one being asked. What I wanted to see was whether you understood the difference between dedication and self-destruction. Many operators can push through pain. Fewer understand when pushing becomes pointless because you won't survive to learn from the experience. She set down the tablet and folded her hands, prosthetic and flesh meeting with a soft click of carbon fiber against bone. You passed both tests, the operational one and the judgment one, which brings us to the reason I brought you here in the first place. Vance pulled out a second tablet, this one showing a document header that Maya recognized from 7 years of wondering what might have been. Personnel evaluation form. Delta Force selection. Her name at the top, followed by fields she'd memorized from staring at her rejection letter until the words burned into her memory. Major Briggs submitted a revised evaluation 3 hours ago. It supersedes the original assessment that separated you from Delta consideration. His new recommendation is acceptance with a notation that his previous judgment was in error and based on criteria that failed to recognize the value of operational restraint. Maya looked at Briggs, who met her eyes with an expression that held apology and something harder to define. Pride, maybe, in a student who'd surpassed the teacher, or relief that he'd finally corrected a mistake that had clearly bothered him for years. Delta is willing to reinstate you. Full operator status, back pay for time in service, clean record. You'd start immediately at Fort Bragg, integrate with an active team, deploy within 6 months. The words should have felt like vindication, should have tasted like victory after 7 years of believing she'd failed because she wasn't ruthless enough. But instead Maya felt a strange emptiness, like she'd climbed a mountain only to discover the view from the top wasn't what she'd expected. And if I say no? Vance smiled, the expression showing more teeth than warmth. Then we discuss the real reason I brought you here. Delta was the test. Revenant is the offer. She swiped to a new screen, this one showing a program designation Maya had never seen before. Project Revenant. Classification level above top secret. Operational parameters that made her pulse quicken despite the exhaustion pulling at her bones. Revenant is a Tier 0 program. Above Delta, above SEAL Team 6, above any special operations unit currently active. The mission profile is strategic delay and disruption operations in denied territory. Solo insertion, minimal support, objectives that require achieving effects without kinetic engagement. You don't destroy enemy capabilities. You delay them, degrade them, make them combat ineffective without giving them casualties to rally around or martyrs to lionize. Maya read the operational summary with growing understanding of what Vance was really offering. Not just reinstatement, evolution. The chance to prove that everything Delta had rejected her for was actually the skill set warfare needed for the next century. Why me? There are hundreds of operators with better records, more experience, fewer question marks in their personnel files. Because most operators solve problems by applying violence until the problem stops existing. That works when you have overwhelming force and don't care about aftermath. It doesn't work when you need surgical precision and permanent solutions instead of temporary suppressions. You've demonstrated the ability to think strategically, act with restraint, and accomplish objectives that would take other operators' entire teams and significant casualties. Vance leaned forward, eyes intense with the focus that came from believing absolutely in what you were saying. The future of warfare isn't bigger explosions. It's precision application of pressure at critical points. Hostage rescues that don't turn into firefights. Regime changes that look like internal collapse instead of foreign intervention. Infrastructure disruption that delays enemy operations without creating civilian casualties that generate international condemnation. That's revenant. That's what I'm offering you. Maya processed the implications while her burned arms throbbed, and her exhausted mind tried to catch up with decisions that would define the rest of her life. Delta had been the dream. Revenant was something she hadn't known existed, the answer to a question she'd been asking since the day they'd failed her for refusing to kill on bad intelligence. What's the first mission? Vance's smile widened slightly. Syria, Eastern Corridor, near the Turkish border. Enemy convoy transporting high-value prisoners to a black site facility. Your objective would be to delay the convoy for 72 hours without engaging enemy forces directly. Create conditions that force them to halt, divert, or slow down enough for an extraction team to insert and retrieve the prisoners. She pulled up a map showing terrain that looked like every desert hellscape Maya had studied during her military career. Mountains, narrow roads, choke points that could be exploited if you knew what you were doing. Supply lines vulnerable to the kind of sabotage that looked like mechanical failure instead of hostile action. Timeline is 6 weeks. You'd have that long to heal, train on mission-specific protocols, and insert. Extraction is not guaranteed. You'd be alone in hostile territory with minimal support and no backup if things go wrong. Maya stared at the map and felt something kindle in her chest that felt like purpose finding direction after years of wandering. This was what she'd been training for without knowing it. This was why she'd spent 7 years working hardware stores and running empty miles, and refusing to let herself become someone who'd given up just because the world told her she wasn't what they needed. Who are the prisoners? Classified until you accept. But I can tell you they're American, they're military, and they've been held for 8 months under conditions that violate every international convention we pretend to care about. Maya closed her eyes and saw the photograph again, the 12 faces of operators who believed they had futures in Delta. One of them was dead in Syria, body never recovered, parents told it was a training accident. She wondered if classified missions were how the military hid failures that didn't fit the narrative of American invincibility. I need time to think about it. Vance stood, tablet under her arm, prosthetic hand resting against her hip, in a posture that spoke to years of learning to balance weight differently. You have until you're medically cleared. 3 days, maybe 4. Use them to decide whether you want to go back to cutting lumber or whether you want to prove that being right matters more than being ruthless. She left and Maya was alone with Briggs, who'd been silent through the entire exchange like he was waiting for permission to speak. The morning light had shifted while they talked, moving across the floor in the slow progression that marked time passing whether you were ready for it or not. You knew about Revenant. Briggs nodded. Vance briefed me 3 weeks ago. Said she had a candidate who'd been failed by Delta for exactly the qualities Revenant required. Asked if I'd be willing to conduct a field evaluation disguised as a doctrine test. So the whole thing was theater. The base, the Marines, the 36 hours. Just an audition for a program I didn't know existed. Not theater. A real test with real stakes. If you'd failed, Revenant would have moved on to other candidates. If you'd succeeded but gotten someone hurt, same result. The evaluation was genuine even if the stated purpose was cover. Maya studied his face, looking for the lie, for whatever angle justified using her, and 250 Marines as props in a recruitment operation. But his expression held nothing but tired honesty, and the regret that came from knowing you'd participated in something necessary but not entirely clean. Why did you help me at the end? You could have let me finish on my own, could have maintained the fiction that you were my adversary instead of my evaluator. Because evaluation ended when I saw you collapse trying to place that last charge. At that point, you'd already proven everything Vance needed to see. Letting you hurt yourself more when the test was over would have been cruelty, not assessment. He pulled the chair Vance had vacated and sat, moving with the careful control of someone whose body was reminding him he wasn't as young as he used to be. For what it's worth, I meant what I said down there. You were right 7 years ago and I was wrong to fail you. Delta lost a good operator because we were measuring for the wrong qualities. I'm glad Vance is giving you the chance to prove that restraint is strength, not weakness. Maya felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of anger she'd carried so long it had become part of her baseline emotional state. Forgiveness wasn't the right word for it. Acceptance, maybe. Recognition that people made mistakes based on the information they had and the doctrines they believed. And sometimes the best you could hope for was that they learned from their errors even if the learning came too late to undo the damage. Thank you for the recommendation, for helping me finish, for admitting you were wrong when you didn't have to. Briggs stood and moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. One more thing, the prisoners in Syria. Vance won't tell you until you accept, but I can tell you this much. One of them is personal, someone you know, someone you thought was gone. He left before Maya could ask what that meant, the door clicking shut with finality that felt like a period at the end of a sentence she hadn't finished reading. She lay back against pillows that smelled like industrial detergent and stared at the ceiling tiles, counting water stains while her mind raced through implications and possibilities. Someone personal, someone she thought was gone. The list of people who fit that description was painfully short, narrowed by 7 years of cutting ties and burning bridges, and trying to build a life that didn't hurt every time she thought about what might have been. Her Delta class, 11 graduates, 1 dead in Syria. James Chen. No body recovered. Training accident, they'd said. Except training accidents didn't happen to Delta operators who'd survived 2 combat deployments and knew their equipment better than they knew their own names. Training accidents were what you told parents when the real story was classified and the body was buried in a grave that didn't officially exist. Maya pulled out her phone from the bedside table where someone had left it along with her other personal effects. She scrolled through contacts she hadn't called in years, found the number for Chen's sister, a woman named Sarah who'd been Delta intelligence and might know things that didn't make it into official reports. The phone rang 4 times before connecting. "This is Sarah Chen." "Sarah, this is Maya Hale, from your brother's Delta class." Silence on the other end, the kind that came from deciding whether to hang up or engage with a voice from a past you'd tried to leave behind. "Maya, I heard you washed out. What do you want?" "Information about James. The real story, not the training accident cover." More silence, longer this time. When Sarah spoke again, her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "You're asking about classified operations. I could lose my clearance just for confirming they exist." "I'm asking because someone just offered me a mission in Syria and told me one of the prisoners is personal. Someone I thought was gone. James is the only person I know who fits that description." The line went quiet for so long Maya thought the connection had dropped. Then Sarah's voice came back rough with emotion she was clearly trying to control. "James isn't dead. He was captured 8 months ago during a Black Ops insertion that went wrong. Intel says he's being moved to a permanent detention facility. The convoy transporting him is the one they're planning to intercept. If you're being offered that mission, it means they think you can delay the convoy long enough for the extraction team to pull him out. Maya felt the world narrow to a single point of focus, everything else fading into background noise that didn't matter. James Chen wasn't dead, was alive, was being held in conditions she didn't want to imagine, and she was being offered the chance to help save him by doing exactly what Delta had failed her for refusing to do carelessly. The choice crystallized with sudden clarity. "Thank you, Sarah, for telling me. Maya, if you take this mission, if you bring him home." Her voice broke and she didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Maya understood what she was asking, what she was hoping for, what it meant to have someone you loved declared dead and then discover they might still be saved if the right person made the right choices. "I'll bring him home, that's a promise." She hung up and lay back against the pillows, burns throbbing and body exhausted, but mind clear for the first time in 7 years. Delta had failed her for refusing to kill on bad intelligence. Now they were asking her to delay an enemy convoy without killing anyone so they could rescue a man she'd trained beside, a friend who'd believed in her when others hadn't, someone who deserved to come home even if it cost her everything. This wasn't about vindication anymore. This was about proving that restraint could save lives instead of just avoiding taking them. This was about showing that being right mattered more than being obedient, that judgment was stronger than ruthlessness, that the future of warfare didn't have to be written in blood. 3 days later, Maya stood in Colonel Vance's office at Fort Bragg, medically cleared and waiting for the briefing that would tell her everything she'd need to know about the mission that would define whether Revenant was revolution or fantasy. Vance pulled up a classified file on the screen behind her desk, images of a convoy route through Syrian mountains, intelligence assessments that painted a picture of an enemy force that was competent but predictable. 3 transport vehicles, 2 security details, scheduled movement through terrain that offered exactly the kind of choke points Maya could exploit if she was smart and careful and willing to suffer. Your objective is delay, not destruction. 72 hours from initial contact to extraction window. You'll have access to local assets for equipment but no direct support once you're inserted. Communications will be limited to status updates on a dead drop schedule. If you're compromised, we disavow and you're on your own. Maya studied the route, seeing possibilities and problems in equal measure. Landslides that could be triggered to block roads, supply caches that could be contaminated to force delays, vehicle maintenance that could be sabotaged to create breakdowns that looked natural. A dozen ways to slow the convoy without firing a shot, if she had the time and the skill and the patience that came from believing the mission mattered more than your own survival. What about the extraction team? When do they insert? 60 hours after your initial contact. You delay for 12 hours, they go in. You delay another 12 hours to cover their exfiltration. If everything goes according to plan, you're out 72 hours after insertion with 0 enemy contact and 1 rescued American operator. And if things don't go according to plan? Vance's expression didn't change. Then you adapt. That's what Revenant operators do. They adapt, they survive, they accomplish the mission even when the mission changes shape around them. She closed the file and fixed Maya with a stare that felt like being evaluated one final time. This is your last chance to walk away. Once you accept, you're committed. No backup plan, no safety net, no guarantee of extraction if things go sideways. Just you and the mission and whatever skills you can bring to bear on a problem that might not have a clean solution. Maya thought about James Chen, about the photograph of 12 operators who believed they had futures, about 7 years of wondering if being right was worth being alone. The answer had always been yes, even when the cost felt too high to pay. Now she had the chance to prove it in ways that mattered beyond her own vindication. I accept. When do I leave? 2 weeks. Training starts tomorrow on mission-specific protocols. You'll learn the terrain, study the enemy patterns, practice with equipment you'll have access to in theater. By the time you insert, you'll know that route better than the people who drive it every day. Vance stood and extended her hand, flesh not prosthetic, the gesture carrying weight beyond the professional courtesy it appeared to be. Welcome to Revenant, Operator Hale. Don't make me regret this. Maya shook her hand and felt the final piece of her life click into place after years of being scattered across decisions and consequences, and the weight that came from knowing you'd chosen a hard road when easier ones were available. The training was exactly as brutal as promised. 2 weeks of studying terrain maps until she could navigate the Syrian mountains blindfolded, learning enemy patrol patterns and supply schedules, and the rhythms of an organization that thought it was secure because it operated in territory where American forces weren't supposed to exist. She practiced with weapons that carried no serial numbers, memorized phrases in Arabic that would let her blend into crowds if necessary, learned to move through checkpoints and roadblocks with the confidence of someone who belonged there. The instructors were former operators themselves, men and women who'd done missions like this before, and understood that survival depended on preparation measured in hours, not minutes. Maya ran miles every morning through North Carolina heat that felt nothing like Syrian mountains, but taught her body to move efficiently under stress. She practiced cliff climbing and rappelling until her hands remembered what it felt like to trust rope and anchor points. She studied satellite imagery until she could identify every rock formation and water source along the convoy route. And every evening, she pulled out the photograph of her Delta class and looked at James Chen's face, memorizing the features of someone she'd trained beside and laughed with, and watched graduate into a career she'd been denied. He'd believed in her when the evaluation board hadn't, had told her privately that Delta was wrong to fail her. That judgment was the most important skill an operator could have, that she'd proven her worth by being right when orders were wrong. Now she would prove it again by bringing him home. The insertion was a nighttime halo jump from an aircraft that officially wasn't there, 30,000 feet above Syrian airspace. Oxygen mask and pressure suit keeping her alive as she fell through darkness toward terrain that would kill her if she made a single mistake with the parachute deployment. She landed in a valley 10 kilometers from the convoy route, gathered her chute in the pre-dawn darkness, and cached it under rocks that would hide it from casual observation. Then she moved toward her first objective, a cliff face overlooking the main road where shaped charges would bring down exactly enough rock to block passage without creating casualties. For 72 hours, Maya became the ghost she'd always been trained to be. She moved between positions like wind, invisible and persistent, creating obstacles that forced the convoy to stop, assess, call for engineering support, waste time. Landslides at choke points. Contaminated fuel that made drivers sick but not critically injured. Mechanical failures that looked natural but were carefully orchestrated. The convoy crawled through terrain that should have taken 8 hours, stretching the journey into 3 days of frustration and delay. Maya watched from hiding positions, counting hours and monitoring radio traffic through a scanner tuned to their frequencies. She heard the confusion in their voices, the growing paranoia that someone was targeting them, the arguments about whether to continue or turn back. At the 60-hour mark, she saw the extraction team insert. 6 operators in civilian vehicles, moving through a checkpoint with forged documents and the casual confidence of locals who had every right to be there. They paralleled the convoy route, staying far enough back to avoid suspicion, close enough to strike when the moment came. Maya created one final distraction, A fire in the lead vehicle's engine compartment that looked like electrical failure, but forced the entire convoy to halt while they assessed whether it was safe to continue. While security forces focused on the burning vehicle, the extraction team moved on the prisoner transport. She watched through binoculars from 2 kilometers away as they breached the vehicle, extracted James Chen in under 90 seconds, and disappeared back into the civilian traffic pattern before anyone realized what had happened. The whole operation took less time than it took her to describe it in her after-action report. Then she began her own exfiltration, moving through the mountains toward the Turkish border using routes she'd memorized during training. Behind her, the convoy was still trying to figure out why their lead vehicle had caught fire and why the prisoner transport was suddenly empty. She crossed the border as dawn broke over the mountains, exhausted and covered in dust but alive and successful. An extraction vehicle waited at the coordinates, driver saying nothing as she climbed in and let herself finally believe that it was over, that she'd succeeded, that James Chen was on his way home because she delayed a convoy for 72 hours without firing a single shot. The drive to the airport was silent. Maya slept most of it, waking only when they reached the military transport that would take her back to Fort Bragg and whatever came next. Colonel Vance was waiting on the tarmac when Maya's aircraft touched down 3 days later. She approached as Maya descended, moving with the careful control her prosthetic required. Mission success. 72-hour delay achieved through non-kinetic means. 0 casualties on either side. Prisoner extracted and currently receiving medical treatment at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. He's going to make it. Maya felt relief wash over her like a physical thing. When can I see him? Vance shook her head gently. Not for a while. He needs time to decompress, medical evaluation, psychological support. 8 months in detention does things that take longer than a few days to process, but he knows you were instrumental in the operation. I made sure of that. She pulled out her tablet and showed Maya a commendation that would never appear in official records. Revenant Program, Mission 1, Operator Hale. Assessment, exceptional performance under extreme conditions. Strategic delay achieved through non-kinetic methodology. 0 casualties. Objective accomplished. Recommend continued operational assignment. Maya read the words and understood what they meant. She'd proven the concept, shown that warfare could be surgical instead of brutal, precise instead of overwhelming, effective without being lethal. Revenant wasn't theory anymore. It was doctrine, and she was the proof. What happens now? Vance's expression shifted into something that might have been a smile if it reached her eyes. Now you decide. Revenant has 6 other missions queued, or you can accept a teaching position, train the next generation. Delta also wants you back on the instruction cadre. Your choice. Maya thought about it. More missions like Syria, alone in hostile territory with nothing but skill and patience. Or teaching, passing on everything she'd learned to operators who needed to understand that being right mattered more than being ruthless. The answer came easier than she expected. I want to teach, show others what I've learned, build something that lasts longer than one mission, one operator, one success. Vance nodded as if that was exactly what she'd hoped Maya would say. Fort Bragg, Delta Instruction Cadre. You start in 6 weeks. That gives you time to write your reports and prepare curriculum for candidates who need what you know. 6 months later, Maya stood in front of 30 Delta candidates, sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked training grounds where she'd once failed to meet standards that turned out to be measuring the wrong things. She wore her uniform again, fabric still feeling strange after years in civilian clothes, but her voice was steady when she spoke. My name is Maya Hale. 7 years ago, I failed this course. They said I wasn't ruthless enough. Said I hesitated when I should have acted. Said I lacked the operational mindset required for Delta assignments. She paused, letting those words settle over the candidates like dust after an explosion. They were wrong, not about the hesitation. That happened, but about what it meant. I hesitated because the intelligence was flawed and the target was innocent. Killing him would have been murder, not warfare. I was right to question the order. They were wrong to fail me for it. The candidates shifted, uncertain whether this was confession or challenge. Maya pulled out the photograph, the one she'd carried through Virginia and Syria and 7 years of doubt. 12 operators in this photo. 11 graduated. One was captured in Syria 8 months ago. I just brought him home by doing exactly what Delta failed me for, delaying an enemy convoy for 72 hours without killing anyone. She set the photograph on the table where everyone could see it. You're here because you're exceptional. Fast, strong, smart, resilient. But none of that matters if you can't think. If you can't judge when intelligence is wrong, when orders don't match reality, when the mission costs more than it's worth. In the observation deck above, Major Briggs stood with arms folded, a small smile on his face that suggested pride in what his former student had become. Beside him, Colonel Vance watched with the satisfaction of someone whose gamble had paid off in ways that would change doctrine for decades. Maya continued, her voice carrying across the training bay with the authority of someone who'd earned every word. Over the next 12 weeks, I'll teach you to be operators who can think, who can question, who can accomplish objectives with minimum necessary force. Sometimes that's a bullet. Sometimes it's patience. You'll learn to tell the difference. And when you graduate, you'll be better than I was, better than what Delta thought they wanted. You'll be what warfare actually needs. The candidates stood at attention, absorbing lessons that would define their careers and possibly save their lives. Maya looked at their faces and saw the same intensity she'd had 7 years ago, the same belief that being good enough meant following orders perfectly. She would teach them different, teach them that being right mattered more than being obedient. That restraint was strength. That judgment was the most powerful weapon an operator could carry. All right, let's begin. The sun climbed higher over Fort Bragg, painting the training grounds in light that promised heat and difficulty, and the crucible that would forge these candidates into something new. Maya began her first lesson, teaching principles she'd learned through failure and vindication, and the understanding that warfare was evolution, and the future belonged to those who could adapt. Somewhere in Landstuhl, James Chen was healing. Somewhere in Syria, a convoy was still trying to understand what had happened. Somewhere in Pentagon briefing rooms, analysts were studying Maya's mission reports and realizing that the future of conflict looked different than they'd planned. But here, in this moment, with 30 candidates watching and waiting, Maya Hale taught the lesson she'd spent 7 years learning, that you didn't win wars by killing more efficiently than the enemy. You won by thinking more clearly, acting more precisely, and never forgetting that being right mattered more than being ruthless. The candidates listened and learned and began their transformation, and Maya watched them with the satisfaction of someone who'd finally found where she belonged, not in the field proving herself over and over, but here, passing wisdom forward, building a legacy that would outlast any single mission. The photograph sat on the table throughout the class, 12 faces watching as a new generation learned from the mistakes and victories of those who'd come before. Maya glanced at it occasionally, drawing strength from those remembered faces, honoring their service by teaching others to be better. This was enough. This was everything. This was what winning looked like when you measured victory in futures created instead of pasts avenged. The sun set over Virginia mountains, painting the sky in colors that reminded her of Syrian dawns and Pentagon conferences and fire towers where she'd watched a base wake to chaos she'd created. She'd climbed those mountains, paid the price in burned skin and exhausted muscles, and 7 years of wondering if being right was worth being alone. The answer had always been yes. Now she had proof, and she had students who would carry that proof forward into conflicts she'd never see, making choices she couldn't predict, but doing it with judgment she'd helped instill. That was legacy. That was vindication. That was what it meant to win without killing, to prove your point without destroying your opponents, to be right when everyone said you were wrong. Maya smiled and continued teaching, her voice steady and certain, passing forward everything she'd learned about warfare and wisdom, and the understanding that the best operators weren't the ones who killed most efficiently. They were the ones who knew when not to kill at all. This story hit different for me. Maya didn't win because she was the best shot. She won because she knew when not to shoot. That's the difference between an operator and a warrior. Question for you veterans out there. Have you ever had to make a call that went against orders because your gut told you the intel was wrong? What happened? And for everyone watching, do you think restraint is strength or is it hesitation? Drop your thoughts below. I read every comment. New story drops Friday. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it.